session today is presented by Old National Bank. And for all our public radio fans, we're excited to bring National Public Radio Chief Economics Correspondent, Scott Horsley. Scott reports on ups and downs of the national economy, as well as fault lines between booming and busting communities. He's spent a decade on the White House beat covering both the Trump and Obama administrations and has done several stories on Nashville's housing market. Scott, welcome to Nashville, and come on up.
Well, thanks so much. I'm not going to talk a real long time. I want to leave some space for your questions and hear what's on y'all's minds. I'm here to learn myself. But I will just try to set the table with some observations from my beat, which is the macroeconomy in the country. You know, in his State of the Union speech back in February, President Trump promised that this was going to be a golden age of America. And if you look at the interior design of the Oval Office, he has totally delivered. But if you want to characterize the broader economy, the picture is a little bit more nuanced. We did get a better than expected jobs report last week showing that U.S. employers added 115,000 jobs in April. But you know, employers added fewer than 200,000 jobs in all of 2025. So it was the weakest year for job growth since the beginning of the pandemic. And at the same time, inflation has now climbed to its highest level in almost 3 years, wiping out the wage gains that workers made in the last year and then some. The combination of rising inflation and an apparently stabilizing job market suggests that the Federal Reserve is going to be unlikely to cut interest rates anytime soon, no matter how much President Trump would like. In fact, at their meeting last month, 3 members of the Fed's rate-setting committee said that their next move could just as easily be an interest rate increase. Now, presidents typically get more credit or blame for economic conditions than they really deserve. But in President Trump's case, it is a pretty short, straight line from his policy choices on tariffs and now the war with Iran to the higher prices we're all paying for a cup of coffee or a gallon of gasoline. And it's a curious move for a president who rode into office promising to address voters' very real frustration with the high cost of living. That frustration is now weighing on the president's own approval rating. A poll that came out for the Washington Post last week showed that Trump's overall approval had fallen to just 37%. And his approval on cost of living had plunged to just 23%. Our own polling at NPR has found similar results. Even the White House had to admit that slapping double-digit tariffs on coffee was not helping to lower prices. And it did not persuade any Iowa farmers to switch from growing soybeans to Java beans. It turns out that taxing a popular breakfast drink without a consent of the public is unpopular, a lesson that most of us learned from the Boston Tea Party. I remember talking to a coffee buyer in Amarillo, Texas last year who had to raise his prices to cover the increased tariffs. And he told me the worst thing about it is none of that price increase was going to the coffee farmers or the coffee roasters or to his baristas. He says it was just a tax, and it felt like lighting money on fire. Now, the Supreme Court has struck down many of those tariffs, and U.S. importers have lined up to collect $166 billion in refunds. The administration moved quickly to replace the outlawed tariffs with a new round of levies, and last week those new import taxes were also struck down by the International Court of Trade. Now, Jay Foreman is one of the importers who challenged those tariffs. He runs a toy company that imports Tonka trucks and Lincoln logs, among other things. He told me it makes sense for the government to impose tariffs on certain strategic goods, but he says using a bazooka instead of a fine-tooth comb has done damage to both businesses and consumers. you know, the president's protectionist policies were supposed to benefit domestic manufacturers. That's what this was supposed to be about. But since Trump came back to the White House, the U.S. has lost 77,000 factory jobs. And it's no wonder, because a lot of U.S. manufacturers rely on some imported components. Every month, the Institute for Supply Management surveys factory managers and publishes a sample of their observations. I read those surveys every month, and for most of the last year, it has just been a litany of complaints about the ever-changing tariff structure, which made it almost impossible for factories to plan or budget. Now, in the most recent survey, which was released at the beginning of last week, those tariff concerns were overshadowed by new worries about soaring energy prices. History may show that the war with Iran is absolutely worth the price that the world is paying, but right at this moment, it's hard to see much of a payoff. Farmers have also suffered from the president's trade war, which has raised their cost of production. At the same time, it's choked off export markets. And farm bankruptcies rose 46% last year. For all these challenges, though, the U.S. economy grew 2% in 2025, and that growth rate continued in the first 3 months of this year, which is absolutely respectable, although it's slower growth than we had in any of the previous 4 years. And right now, growth is being propped up to some extent by the massive business investments in artificial intelligence. And we will find out if that turns out to be money well spent, or if it's not just the intelligence that's artificial. Investment in residential real estate, as I don't need to tell you all, is also a drag on the economy, although I see that Nashville is doing considerably better than the national average. And mortgage rates, which briefly dipped below 6% earlier this year, are now moving up again. They were averaging close to 6.4% last week. I know Lawrence Yuen's going to talk to you later about what that means for housing affordability and for your business. It also has an impact on consumer spending, which, as we know, is the biggest driver of the U.S. economy, because there had been hopes that if those mortgage rates continue to trend down, some people who'd bought homes with a high 6 or 7% mortgage might be able to refinance, freeing up a few $100s a month to spend on other things. But as long as rates stay in the mid-6s, that's going to have to wait. On the other hand, the stock market keeps hitting record highs. So where do you want to place your bets? I am not much of a gambler, although I have occasionally lost some money at the blackjack table, which is easy to do. It is harder to lose money when you run the casino, but if you really work at it, it can be done. Back in the late 1980s, there was a gaming analyst named Marvin Rothman who warned that the soon-to-open Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City was not going to be able to generate enough revenue to cover its massive debt. And Rothman told the Miami Herald and the Wall Street Journal, sure, the casino would draw a big crowd when it first opened, curious customers would turn out, but after those first few months of looky-loos, there was no way the casino could cover its overhead, which was financed with very high-priced debt. So, how did the casino's owner react to this warning? Well, Donald Trump sued the brokerage firm where Rothman worked and got him fired, just as the president fired the top number cruncher at the Labor Department last summer after a disappointing jobs report. And just as he has tried to silence other voices at universities and in the mainstream media, including public radio, who might question his version of reality. But you all probably know how this story ends. Trump should have listened to Rothman, or at least his lenders should have, because just as the analysts predicted, the Taj Mahal got big crowds when it first opened, and then when winter came to Atlantic City, the traffic slowed, the bills went unpaid, and within a year, the casino was bankrupt. You can fire the messenger, you can shout down your critics, you can take a Sharpie and redraw the hurricane map, but it does not change the shape of the storm. By the way, don't worry about Marvin Rothman. He won a hefty settlement from Trump and is doing very well. So, where are we now? Consumers are still spending money, although not as freely as they had been. And that spending is increasingly concentrated among wealthy families who are buoyed by their growing retirement accounts, and their rising home values. And for the first time ever, Delta Airlines says it's making more money from those premium seats at the front of the plane than the much more numerous cramped seats in the back. And some businesses are leaning into that breakdown, aiming more of their products at the top earners, while businesses that cater to the more downscale customers are struggling. The credit reporting company TransUnion says debt levels are rising at both the super premium part of the economy and the subprime part. And the average credit card holder now has a balance of about $6,500. Now, for wealthy households who are paying it off every month and getting rewards, that's very manageable. But for families living paycheck to paycheck, it is worrisome. For the moment, tax refunds are helping to prop up consumer spending, especially by those on the lower rungs of the income ladder. And thanks to the GOP tax bill passed last year, those refunds are, on average, about $330 bigger than they were a year ago. But once those refunds are spent, forecasters say we could be in for some additional belt tightening. Last week, I talked to some restaurant managers about whether customers are cutting back because of what's happening with gas prices. In California, where pump prices are averaging about $6 a gallon, the Broken Yoke Cafe says they have seen some decline in their midweek business. And a restaurant chain based in Columbus, Ohio, told me that business travelers are spending less now at high-end steakhouses. And families are, in some cases, trading down to more casual eateries. But people still spent freely last weekend on Mother's Day, which turns out for many restaurants is the busiest day of the year. So thanks, Mom. Inflation's climbing. For the 12 months ending in April, it was 3.8%. But you know, that official cost of living figure does not fully capture the way that inflation plays out for different families in different ways. When prices go up, it's usually the people at the bottom of the income ladder who get hit the hardest. For one thing, as we all know, their consumption basket's a little bit different. Their budgets are tilted towards necessities like rent and groceries, which are not easily avoided. They also typically have less time to shop around, less ready cash to take advantage of, buy 3, get 1 free offers, and often less access to the suburban warehouse stores that might have the cheapest prices. For most of the last 3 years, wages were generally climbing faster than prices, so workers were seeing real gains in their purchasing power. But as I mentioned, with the April calculation, that progress has now reversed itself, and wage gains are cooling off just as inflation is heating up. Soaring gas prices are the most visible sign of our inflation today, but they're not the only driver. The Wall Street Journal recently wrote about the rising cost of doggy daycare at Camp Bow Wow here in Nashville, as an illustration of what's happening with the upward pressure we're seeing on service prices. Camp Bow Wow employs about 24 people, and the owners recently gave them a pay raise to help keep them around. They raised prices by 9% to cover the cost. None of the customers barked. It's still cheaper than childcare. The unemployment rate remains very low by historical standards, 4.3% nationwide, 3.1% here in Nashville. If you've got a job, your odds of losing it are pretty low. But if you are laid off, or if you're, say, a new college grad who's trying to get a foot in the door, there just are not a lot of new openings to choose from. Now, while we're not adding a lot of new jobs, we're not adding a lot of new workers either. In fact, the labor force has been shrinking in recent months. In April, there were about 650,000 fewer people working or looking for work than there were a year ago. Now, this is partly the result of the administration's crackdown on immigration, both legal and illegal. It's also, though, largely a demographic story. More than 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day. And with record low birth rates, we are not producing enough future workers to replace them. For years, the United States has relied on immigration to keep its population growing, but that stream has largely dried up. In fact, some forecasters in Washington are projecting that we could actually see a net outflow of international migrants this year, in 2026, for what would be the first time since at least 1960. Now, the administration's theory is that there is a reserve army of native-born workers, potential workers, who are not working now, who are sitting on the sidelines, but who will come into the workforce if that competition from foreign-born workers is removed. I'm not persuaded by that argument, but we will see. A working paper released last week actually showed that the opposite seems to be happening so far, that for every undocumented worker who is deported, 6 others drop out or go underground, and 1 native-born worker is laid off. Economists have long argued that foreign-born workers are primarily complements for native-born workers, not competition. Now, the administration has also argued that mass deportation will help to lower rents. And I can imagine there are some communities in this country where there is a very large concentration of undocumented immigrants where that may be the case. But, as we all know, immigrants are also a critical part of the construction workforce, without whom it is going to be harder to address our national housing shortage. And I spent some time last year in Dayton, Ohio, where immigrants had really made a positive difference by fixing up and occupying what had been dilapidated and vacant homes and filling jobs that otherwise were going vacant. I want to say just a few words about the federal budget. We are halfway through the current fiscal year, and the government is running a $1.2 trillion deficit so far in the first 6 months. And in March, the federal debt held by the public topped 100% of GDP. That has rarely happened in U.S. history. It happened briefly during the early days of the pandemic because GDP shrank so much that the debt surpassed it. And it happened just after World War II. But that's it. Now, there is nothing magical about debt exceeding 100% of GDP. The difference between 99 and 101% is not enormous, but it is a milestone that is worth noting and maybe asking what the possible downsides are. For one thing, having trillions of dollars, tens of trillions of dollars in federal debt, coupled with today's rising interest rates, means that the federal government is now spending in excess of $1 trillion a year just paying the interest on its past purchases. That's before we have paved a mile of interstate highway. It's before we've emptied the first trash can at a national park. We spend more on interest than we do on national defense, more than Medicare, more than anything else the government does, with the exception of Social Security. Carrying that much debt, of course, means the government has less flexibility to spend the next time there is a real crisis, and I think we can all rest assured that there will be another crisis of some sort at some point in the future. And ultimately, when the government has to borrow that much money, it makes it more expensive for anyone else who wants to borrow money, to grow a business, or send a kid to college, or purchase a home. And so far, there is little sign that Washington is about to change course. That GOP tax bill passed last year adds trillions of dollars in additional debt, and we are not going to get out of that hole with tariffs or some miracle growth rate, or, as some on the left would argue, simply by taxing the very, very rich. Now, for all of these challenges, it does seem as if the president and those around him are not chastened, but rather emboldened. After snatching Nicolas Maduro and his wife from Venezuela, Trump suggested that Colombia and Cuba and even Greenland better watch their backs. And of course, 2.5 months ago, he joined Israel in attacking Iran. Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, said on CNN, "You can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else, but we live in a world that's governed by strength, that's governed by force, that's governed by power." Miller grew up in the cushy enclaves of Santa Monica, so I'm not sure where he formed that law of the jungle worldview, but The Hobbesian world he describes is not one that most of us, I think, want to live in. And as an economics reporter, I can tell you it's not one that most people want to do business in either. For 80 years, the rule of law has helped to keep the peace around the world. And it's been darn good for prosperity as well. Now, I will confess, for most of my lifetime, I did not pay a lot of attention to the rule of law. It was like roads and sewers and title insurance. Things you just take for granted, but that would be pretty hard to live without. But it turns out the rule of law is much more fragile than I thought. When I first moved to Washington, D.C. in 2008, I almost never saw anyone jump over a turnstile at the subway. And not because police were writing a lot of tickets, it was just part of the social compact. We all pulled out our fare cards and paid to ride the metro. But during the pandemic and the unrest that followed the murder of George Floyd, the city stopped enforcing the fare laws, and pretty quickly, word got around. And before you knew it, there was a second epidemic of turnstile jumping, even more widespread than COVID. And I'm not just talking about juvenile offenders. I mean, you would see grown men and women dressed in business suits walking to jobs on K Street, calmly stepping over the fare gate. And at first, maybe they got some angry stares, but hardly anybody said a word. And once that kind of rule-breaking becomes normalized, honest people start to feel like chumps for doing their part and paying the fare. That's not sustainable for a subway or a civilization. And many people who live along the southern border felt the same way when record numbers of migrants came spilling across unchecked in 2022 and 2023. Whatever you think our immigration policy ought to be, I think we all want something more orderly than that. But it's not just subway strap hangers and desperate asylum seekers who take notice when the cops on the beat suddenly disappear or look the other way. When OSHA stops policing workplace safety violations, employers get reckless, and more children end up doing dangerous work. When the IRS lays off so many auditors, it can't police wealthy business owners. Tax cheats have a field day. And when the Justice Department uses bogus charges to harass the president's perceived enemies, that's not just stepping over a turnstile, that's smashing it to bits. Whatever the rule of law means, it can't be the president gets to do whatever he wants. It can't be selling advanced computer chips to China is a national security threat, unless the government gets a share of the proceeds. It can't be that the president can dictate that Intel has to fire its CEO, only to praise that CEO a week later when he hands over a 10% stake in the company. As Greg Mankiw, who served as a White House economist in the George W. Bush administration, said, that is not the rule of law. That is a mafia-style shakedown. And the chairman of the FCC sounds like a mob boss when he tries to dictate programming to local television stations saying, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. President Trump himself used similar language in threatening Greenland. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. That's not good for business. Who wants to operate in that kind of lawless environment? And if we tolerate it, if the courts, the media, the business community sit quietly and allow the vast powers of the presidency to be turned into an extortion racket for squeezing concessions out of law firms and TV networks and trading partners, then shame on us for swapping the rule of law for a culture of corruption. Now, I'm happy to say the Supreme Court has made it clear there are limits to the president's tariff authority. And I'm happy to say that ABC and its parent company Disney are now pushing back against the FCC's intimidation campaign. And for this audience in particular, I'm happy to say that title insurance is still intact. So with that, I'll stop and I'll take some of y'all's questions.
You mentioned a number of economic headwinds we might be facing in different areas. What is something we might be underestimating in our current local real estate market that is a headwind that we might face, that we might not be looking out for?
Well, I won't speak to the local Nashville market because y'all know that better than I do. But I think one of the things we've certainly learned over the over the 30 years I've been doing this is that the big risk that's out there is never the one you're anticipating. It's the one that you didn't see coming at all. There are some that we can certainly see coming, or at least potential risks, and that we want to be aware of. And I think these apply to Nashville. They're not in any way unique to Nashville, but I think the climate risk is very real in all parts of the country. Y'all are not on the coast, so it's not, and you're not, you're not facing the kind of drought that they're facing out west. But I think there's no part of the country that's not going to be affected by that. I think the artificial intelligence story is. I am by no means an expert on that. I hear forecasts that are catastrophic, and I hear forecasts that are very rosy. And I think a lot depends on what the pace of the change with that is. Is it a change that we can adjust to, as we have with lots of past technological advances? Whether electricity or the steam engine, or I was telling somebody the other day, the turn of the last century, 40% of the population was in agriculture, and today it's 2%. And we adjusted that just fine. We don't have 38% of unemployed former farmers. But if that happens very quickly, that kind of change, if the white collar workforce is radically changed, radically altered by AI in a short period of time, the adjustment could be challenging. And we look all the time at the household balance sheet statistics. How are we doing? What share of credit cards are 30 days past due or 90 days past due? What share of, luckily we haven't seen anything like that with mortgages, but so far the numbers have kind of been moving in the wrong direction. They all got really much better early in the pandemic because people couldn't spend very much money on stuff, and the government was sending out checks to everybody. They kind of reverted to their pre-pandemic status, and in some cases they've gotten a little bit worse. But they're not really alarming. But you always say to yourself, okay, that's where they are when the unemployment rate is 4.3%, or 3.1 in Nashville. If it took a turn for the worse, would that indebtedness, that household indebtedness, be a real problem? Possibly. And I talked about the booming stock market. The bond market has had a very different approach, and one of them's right. Either the sky's the limit folks in the stock market are onto something, or the worrywarts in the bond market are onto something, and we'll find out. Keep your portfolios diversified. Yes, ma'am. Who's got the mic? We'll work for you.
Given the falling administration poll numbers and their likelihood to use executive privilege, do you feel like you're going to find some type of housing help in the future in the term of first-time homebuyer credits, or with a new Fed chair in Warsh, do you see big MBS purchases or any other ways to manipulate the long-term borrowing rates?
I haven't seen any signs of executive action by the current administration in terms of encouraging first-time home buyers. I know Lawrence's most recent stats for April, I think nationwide we got up to 1/3 of the home sales in April were first-time buyers, which is not great by historical standards, but an improvement from where we have been in some periods in the past. So there's a little bit of improvement there. Warsh has talked about wanting the Fed to have a smaller footprint in the economy. So I don't don't think he is going to be an advocate for buying up a lot of mortgage-backed securities. He was critical of that back at the time of the housing crisis, and I think that would be off-brand for him. Now, whether his colleagues at the Fed push in that direction, it's possible, but they've basically been dialing back their holdings of MBS and letting those roll off the books, and they're sort of trying to get out of that business. So I don't think we're going to see a lot of relief there. As I say, it looked earlier this year as if mortgage rates in general were trending down, and I know it's not reassuring to young people trying to buy a first home today. I mean, when I bought my first home, the mortgage rates were 8%, and I'm old enough to remember the 1970s when double-digit mortgage rates were not at all uncommon. The difference, of course, is home prices are a lot higher now. We sort of priced houses for 3% mortgages, and then mortgage rates went up and the home prices didn't come down at all. So I had a guy in California one time told me that, the sales price is really just a artificial construct. It's all about the monthly payment. And I think that's an exaggeration, as y'all certainly know. Somebody actually has to pay that sales price, and somebody actually gets that sales price. But typically when mortgage rates moved as much as they did, you would have seen some adjustment at the sales price, and we haven't really seen that time. So we've got this tough combination. A 6.5% mortgage or a 6.4% mortgage is certainly not high in the history of the country, but if it's matched with a $400,000 or $500,000 sales price, it makes those monthly payments pretty steep. But yeah, so to answer your question, I don't see a lot of relief coming on that score from either the administration or from the Fed, but perhaps there'll be some relief from some other quarter. Who's got the mic?
First of all, I want to say thank you for honesty and being so brave in the state of Tennessee.
What are they going to do, cut our funding?
Well, you understand the temperature. But my question is, with the deregulation happening again and lack of oversight, are we looking at a potential 2008 situation happening again?
You're talking about financial regulation in particular.
Yes.
Obviously, lots of changes,
Yes.
lots of deregulation on the environmental front as well, and I talked about the climate risk. But it's a very good question. After the financial crisis, Dodd-Frank was passed, and an enormous amount of regulation was put in to try to prevent something like that from happening again. I think there's some legitimate academic question about whether that regulation was overkill, and whether it was really helpful when you look at things like what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. I think the good news is in terms of the housing market in particular, I don't think we've got anywhere near the kind of reckless financial engineering that we had in the 06, 07 run up to that crisis. I don't think anybody's gone in that direction. I think there are other corners of the financial world, crypto comes to mind, where there are probably lots of risks that we may be underpricing, and we've seen a radical turnaround in the approach to regulating those things from the former SEC to the current SEC, the former Senate Banking Committee to the current Banking Committee. The crypto people have thrown a lot of money around to put more friendly people in power in Washington. That worries me more than what we might see in terms of the housing side. But I vividly remember talking to folks from the Center for Responsible Lending in, I think it was 2006 or about 2006, and they did put out a warning, and all they said was, if home prices flatten out or actually come down, an awful lot of people are at risk, because housing was so leveraged on the assumption that prices only go up, right? And if you get in trouble, you can always sell and pay it off and walk away. And then that was true until it wasn't. And I think there are people sounding similar alarms about other parts of our financial house now, not the housing side, but other parts. And everything's okay until it's not. And certainly we are in a looser regulatory environment now than we were for most of the last decade.
Like the 50-year mortgage situation.
Yeah. 50 or more. That may have been the fastest deflating trial balloon I've ever seen in Washington, and thank goodness, because it was criticized from every angle, and it was a brain dead idea. But other questions? Oh. Yeah, my colleague Stephen Basaha just recently did a story about that. A lot of people had no idea that there even were any transferable mortgages. They're obviously a pretty small part of the market now, but a lot of your VA loans are, and it's not a perfect solution if the person selling has been in the home for a while and there's been a lot of appreciation, because you can only assume the remainder of the mortgage, which may not cover half of the current sales price, but it can certainly be helpful. And yeah, I think that's an area where there maybe are some avenues to broaden that out a little bit, or at least to educate people about what the opportunities are now. Certainly somebody who has a mortgage that they are able to transfer, that's, for a seller, that's a selling point for sure. And I don't think a lot of people are as informed about that. I think that was y'all probably know better than I believe that was a bigger part of the market in previous decades. But in terms of, are lenders going to start making that a real common thing? I guess that's going to depend on, what the securitization people say and what kind of premium they would ask in return for making this more of a long-term commitment, and whether that premium would offset the advantages to the would-be buyers. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so how do you see the Federal Reserve's current rate stance impact housing demand over the next 12 to 18 months, especially in growth markets like Nashville?
Well, as I say, as much as the president would like the Fed to lower rates, I think it's going to be challenging. And as much as Kevin Warsh has said, he thinks there is room to lower mortgage rates, in part because he sees enormous productivity benefits coming through the artificial intelligence revolution. I think he's going to run into opposition from many of his FOMC colleagues. There were three who were outspoken at the last meeting in saying that they thought that they needed to change the language because it was as likely they would be raising rates as their next move than cutting. And there are certainly others, and it's not only the Reserve Bank presidents, it's also members of the governing board who have been pretty hawkish when it comes to that. I mean, Chris Waller, I think, was one of the more dovish members of the FOMC and of the Fed governing board, and I think Chris has been very prescient in seeing bends in the economic road, and he was someone who last summer was really warning of potential weakness in the labor market and pushing for more aggressive or more dovish moves by the Fed. But even he has kind of backed off from that and is now saying, okay, I think the job market looks okay, and not okay, but the job market looks like it's not fallen off a cliff, and obviously inflation's moving in the wrong direction. And so, if the number one dove on the board is sounding that, I just think it's going to be very hard for Warsh and the president, no matter how much jawboning they do, to make any meaningful cut in the federal funds rate. And of course, as y'all all know, mortgage rates don't necessarily move in tandem with the federal funds, right? They're more affected by 10-year treasuries and things like that, which, you know, they've also been moving in the wrong direction. As I say, the bond market overall has been pretty bearish on the war. So. Yes, sir.
I've been seeing reports of CEOs offloading massive amounts of stock, from Zuckerberg to, you know, Jeff Bezos and so on, and I think Berkshire Hathaway CEO as well. Is that possibly artificially propping up the stock market? I'm very novice in my knowledge there, but just wanted to hear what your opinion is on there's quite a long list of CEOs that are offloading massive amount of stock.
Well, I mean, in theory, it shouldn't prop it up. If anything, it should make people question. You know, who knows better the fortunes of Berkshire Hathaway than Greg Abel right now? So if he's selling, maybe I should sell it. In theory, it should put downward pressure. You know, the challenge in making any kind of broad statements about the stock market right now is there's the S&P 493, and then there's the Magnificent Seven. And, you know, a very outsized share of the overall gains in the market have been from a pretty small slice of the pie, mostly big tech giants and you know, NVIDIA and people like that. You know, there are certainly exceptions. There are other more mainstream consumer-oriented companies that are doing just fine. But I don't. In theory, it doesn't seem like insider sales, especially if they're publicized or, you know, made public, that I wouldn't think that would be inflating the market value. No. Although I always yield to my New York colleague Maria Aspen when it comes to stock market. I frequently get a call at 3 in the afternoon. Hey, can you do a story about what's moving the stock market today? Like, if I knew what was moving the stock market on any given day, I could be making more money than this. But that won't stop me from going on the radio and saying, well, the stock market moved up or down in response to X, Y, or Z, and you got to have a story. I love, there was an old cartoon one time. It said something like, the Dow gained 300 points today on rumors that the Dow would gain 300 points today. Market psychology is a crazy thing. I mean, just to take one example from, I think it was last week, or maybe it was even earlier this week. But I think it was last week when GameStop said it was going to offer $56 billion for eBay, and GameStop's worth $10 billion, $11 billion, something like that. But where are they going to get $56 billion? But they were one of those meme stocks, and so who knows? But I think the market took a pretty dim view of that offer, and certainly the eBay board did. So eBay knows a little thing about auctions and generating excitement. So
I've got a question right here. First of all, we really appreciate GNR putting this on and you being here today. I was wondering if you could speak on the next few years as we see probably one of the largest transfers of wealth and how that's going to impact the next community. Like, we are seeing the middle class seems to shrink. Do you see that equaling out a little bit more, or do you see kind of even more of a gap? And what do you see that impacting in the real estate market?
Yeah, well, it's obviously, to the extent that ancestors pass away and leave fortunes to their struggling kids or grandkids, it can help to get over that hump of that down payment. So that's one piece of it. But what's sometimes described as the silver tsunami or this massive transfer of wealth, that does seem to be something that's going to be stretched out over a long period of time. And seniors, especially those who have a lot of means, are living a long time. And it may very well be that by the time they pass it on to their kids that it may be more useful for their grandkids in terms of getting them a toehold in something like the costly housing market or college education or whatnot. But it is certainly true that there is a cohort of seniors who are sitting on an enormous pile of wealth, and when that gets unlocked, it can have profound effects throughout the economy. As with housing, though, what we've seen is that it may not be unlocked when either the seniors would want to or their descendants would want to. We've seen that. Y'all all know this story of all the folks who are at an age when typically they would be selling the family home and either downsizing or moving to a retirement community, and for various reasons, some not by and large the golden handcuffs of mortgage rates, but just where they want to stay, the lifestyle and so forth. They're not moving in the numbers that we might have expected them to move, and it may be something similar with their non-residential assets. I did do a story a couple 3 years ago about just this sort of cohort of older folks who are staying put and kind of making it challenging for younger families to move up into those family homes. And I learned that the number one job for home remodelers was modifying family homes to accommodate age-in-place seniors. And I'm sure y'all have seen that even in a fairly youthful market like this one.
Scott, I'll ask you over here, over the right side. Go your right. This will be a final question. We want to thank you again so much for being here today. Leave us with something like maybe what's a niche market or niche consumer good that you seem to like to pay attention to as a greater indicator of what might be happening on a larger scale. I know you talked about coffee, but what other things do you look at when you're just kind of, hey, this is a really interesting or maybe niche thing to be paying attention to that can kind of give you a better idea of what's happening on a larger scale?
Sure, I'll give you a couple. There actually, I think it was the Wall Street Journal did a story about coffee the other day, and I mean, one thing that is you can't escape with coffee is it is an addictive drug, and it doesn't matter what the price is, people are gonna pay to have their morning java. So that's a very price inelastic good for sure. They may trade down, and we are seeing a lot of trading down in lots of sort of staple things. I mean, this is a real challenge for the packaged goods industry. All the brand names who were able to price very aggressively during the early part of the pandemic, when people said, well, I can't go out to restaurants, so I might as well splurge on all the nice stuff in the grocery store. We saw very large price increases for a lot of the brand name packaged goods, and then when the 40-year high inflation hit, everyone discovered that the Safeway brand mayonnaise is pretty good. And when Hellman's went to $7 a jar, I switched, and I can't tell the difference. So, but I mentioned that Institute for Supply Management report that comes out every month, and there's always these sort of interesting anecdotes in there about industries that are feeling the pinch. And of course, we've all heard about crude oil and natural gas and fertilizer being stuck in the Strait of Hormuz. Evidently, frankincense is also stranded there. And there was a frankincense importer who said between the tariffs and the higher transportation costs, they were really getting squeezed. And I said, wait, there's a frankincense importer in the United States? Who's buying frankincense? And it turns out there's a pretty large market. I mean, historically, it was used to burn in church services, and the Catholic Church used to be one of the big purchasers. But now it's made into all kinds of aromatherapy type stuff, and creams and lotions and unguents and so forth. And it's I didn't know what frankincense actually was, other than the gift for the baby Jesus along with myrrh and gold. But what it is, it's like sap that comes out of a tree that mostly only grows in Yemen and a few other parts of the Horn of Africa. And we import thousands of pounds of this resin, this sap from these trees, and costs have gone up because of the Strait of Hormuz being shuttered, and so they're having to air freight it out, and I don't know if that's a leading indicator, because I do think frankincense probably has a much higher elasticity of demand. I think if the price gets high enough, people will dial back on frankincense, but that was definitely a niche product to me, and one of the things that's fun about my job is I do learn something new most days, and I know I'm going to learn something new from the rest of the program today. So thank you all for the good questions and all your comments, and let me know.